Okay, this is part 3 of the video tutorial series we'll be doing on this little animation where we cover all the steps of the process from concept to creation, or I guess animation to creation since we didn't cover modeling. What we're going to be doing this time is going to be setting up render passes, and for this animation we'll be setting up a diffuse pass or a beauty pass, an ambient occlusion pass, and we'll make sure we export our diffuse frames as RPFs, and we'll probably set up a specular pass as well. So we're going to open up our render settings here, change our sampling quality for, we've got mental ray as our renderer. We're going to change our sampling quality to 64 so we don't get any aliasing going on. We've got shadows turned on, just simple shadow map shadows. That'll do pretty well. The soft shadows will simulate with our ambient occlusion. So I'll be using Backburner to render things. We could just render right in Max, but I have two machines here, so what I'll be doing is I'll be kicking off renders, and then when those renders are rendering on the other machine, I'll continue working on this one and explaining the process of setting up renders and whatnot. So in our render settings, we want to make sure we're rendering our whole sequence. We want to change the resolution to something that is a little more bigger and appealing, 960 by 540. We're going to make sure everything's in the frame at all times that we want to see. Maybe we can back out the camera a little bit. We do have a camera set up, but it's purely stationary. And so I think everything stays in frame right now, and this should be pretty good. Just want to make sure we've got the safe frames turned on. We don't want stuff to go outside the safe frame, because if this was for broadcast, that would mean it would be getting cut off on the screen. So that's probably about good there. We're going to save our output, and we've got our folder here. I'm going to create a new renders folder. And of course, I pressed enter too soon. Sometimes XP lags a little bit behind when you create new folders, but there we go. And oops, we're going to create a folder called Beauty. This is, once again, there's there. We're going to use this folder to save our diffuse beauty frames. We're going to make RPF files. And here's the settings for RPF images. We've got bits per channel 8 will be fine. We also want to have optional channels Z depth and velocity turned on. Actually, in this case, we probably don't need Z depth. Z depth would be for depth of field. So we can probably turn that one off and just keep velocity on. This velocity will give us our velocity channel so that we can add motion blur later using the Real Smart motion blur plugin from Revision. So now that we've got that set up, we can turn on net render, and then we'll click render, and our render settings will come up. So we'll just call this pass ball beauty, and then connect to our the computer's name is slave. It looks like the manager isn't turned on, so we'll VNC, this is using remote desktop, over to our other computer, open up the manager, and then try to reconnect. And now we're connected to the manager. We can submit our job, so that'll submit our job to the manager, and now the other machine will start rendering it, because the other machine also has a server opened up on it, and the server is what actually does the rendering. So we're going to save a copy of this file and save it as ball3 underscore AO for ambient occlusion. Now we're going to set up our ambient occlusion pass. So we want to keep our renderer as mental ray. We want to go to the processing tab up top, do a material override, and then set up a new ambient occlusion material. And that way we can basically replace all the materials in the scene with an ambient occlusion material without actually changing the materials applied to the objects. So we're going to select ambient occlusion, put it in our diffuse slot, change the samples to 64 so we don't get too much grain. Also change the self-illumination of the shader to 100%. And then we will drag this over to our material override slot, do an instance so that if we make any changes they propagate over to the slot over here, and then just do a quick test render somewhere where the ball is expanded there, and make sure that we're getting a good amount of soft shading going on, but we don't want things too dark. But we can always, of course, adjust that later in the compositing application of our choice. So it's going to go through and render this frame here, but so far, from what I can see on the left-hand side, it's looking okay. We might be a good idea just to turn the spread, or sorry, the max distance, change it to a custom setting. Basically this will, right now that'll set a threshold for how far away objects have to be in order for it to calculate ambient occlusion for them. So that max distance is a little bit small. Maybe if we change it up to about 35. Before we were getting a lot of dark gray areas, but this will help us to sort of isolate really just the sort of crease or corner areas that we want to be occluded. So that's almost there. Maybe we can turn it. Maybe we can just turn that up a little bit higher, maybe to about 50, and hopefully this should bring it a little bit closer. We just want it to a point where the open surfaces that aren't pressing up against any other objects are basically white. So that's looking pretty good. Just bump it up a little bit more, but I'm sure that'll be fine. So once we turn it up to 60, now we're ready to render. So we're going to go back to our render settings up here. We can keep the time output the same, the resolution the same. We're just going to change our file, and you can already see there's 3 frames in here because the other computer's already started rendering. So now we're going to make a new folder called ambient occlusion. We're going to change the output format to targas. We don't need another RPF sequence because the other frames will contain all the RPF data that we need. And we're going to kick off this the same way as we did before. Just basically connect to the manager, submit the job, and then there we're done. So one more pass that it might be nice to do, if we just save that one and resave this one as part3 specular, is a pass where we basically, because all the materials are metal, we will isolate sort of the specular of these materials. And of course specular is just a way of faking glossy reflections that you'd see in real life. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another material, and we're going to make the material black and give it a really high but really tight specular. So specular level is about 600, but glossiness is about 80. So then we're going to open up our render settings and make sure our other material override is turned off. And we're actually just going to change the renderer overall. So we're going to turn it back to the scanline renderer. The reason we're using metal ray before is because since we have reflections on some of our objects, metal ray can crank through ray tracing a lot faster than scanline renderer can. But because we don't have reflections here, we don't need it. So we're going to turn off shadows. Mapping we can keep on, and now we're just going to apply that black material to all of our objects. And of course, because we saved a new file, if we want the old materials, we can always revert back to the other file. So now we can see that we're sort of isolating some of the specular amounts, but the outside paint material we don't really need a high specular on, because that's sort of a flat paint shader. So what we're going to do is we're going to select all of the objects that are part of the sort of casing of the robot and just apply a black material. So that way only things like the inner parts have that high specular. And it's going to be very subtle. You can't see it in a whole lot of shots. You can sort of see the bright white line there, the little dot there. But it'll be subtle enough that it'll just add that little bit of extra detail that we need. Looks like the inner sphere is casting a little bit too much specular, so we'll turn that one off too. So now just the metal pistons, we can even see in the viewport, they're what are receiving all the specular attention. So that looks pretty cool, and that'll help us to give it, once again, that sort of metal look. So now that we've got this pass set up, actually our rotor blades we can probably disable the specular for as well, so we'll just apply that black material. But now that we've got that set up, we can kick off this pass, and we're going to call it our specular pass, and specular.tga, once again using targas. Kick off a net render, connect to the manager, submit the job, and we will now wait. So part 4 will be covering the actual compositing, which is the last step, because in this one we've kicked off all the renders. So tune in for part 4, and we'll cover the final step of the process, and we'll see how this little animation that we've created in a couple of hours actually looks when it's done.